A little bit later on, Alan is going to be looking at what that chapter of Ruth might be saying to us today. But for now, I want to look at two words that very much underlie the passage and indeed underlie the book of Ruth. One of those we've already been introduced to, the word chesed. The other word is the word goel, which is translated in English language versions of the Bible as something like kinsman redeemer or guardian redeemer. Now, to talk about redeeming, to use the word redeem, it's not a word that we use very often in our everyday language these days. We might talk about redeeming a coupon at the supermarkets. We might talk about buying a financial bond that has a redemption or a buyback value. We might talk about someone redeeming their reputation or a situation being redeemed. And if you wrap all of those slightly subtly different meanings into one ball, then you're ready to be introduced to the idea of the Redeemer as it appears in Old Testament law. And to understand where it comes from, you need to go back to the Israelites going into the Promised Land. And if you remember, the Promised Land was divided up between the different tribes, and within each tribe, their portion was split up between the clans and the families. And it was thought important to try and preserve that situation. And so if anything threatened that, within the law it was laid down the means of actually keeping that situation in place. So in the book of Leviticus, we read this: "If one of your fellow Israelites becomes poor and sells some of their property, their nearest relative is to come and redeem what they have sold. And if that situation then became so desperate that people are being forced to sell themselves into slavery, it says this: if a foreigner residing among you becomes rich, and any of your fellow Israelites become poor, and sell themselves to the foreigner, or to a member of the foreigner's clan, they retain the right of redemption after they have sold themselves. One of their relatives may redeem them. An uncle or a cousin or any blood relative in their clan may redeem them." There were other aspects to the role of being a redeemer, but here we see the main two. First of all, to protect land that might have had to be sold outside of the family, and secondly, to protect members of the family who, through their desperate situations, might have been forced to sell themselves into slavery. And as we reconnect with Naomi and Ruth's story, as they return to Bethlehem, we see that they are indeed in a desperate situation. It doesn't appear that anyone has come to their aid because Ruth has no choice but to go gleaning in the fields as the fields are being harvested. And this is another provision made in the law. We call it gleaning. And this was to protect the poor. And what it did was to give the poor rights to go into people's fields and pick up any small bits that were left behind after the harvesters had passed by. Now, in view of Naomi and Ruth's desperate situation, we can hear the joyful hope in Naomi's voice when she realises that it is Boaz who has shown Ruth kindness as she has gleaned in his fields. That man, Naomi says, is our close relative. He is one of our guardian redeemers. And this will become the central theme of our story as we move on through chapters 3 and 4. Before moving on, though, we should recognise that the Old Testament also sees God as being our Goel, our Redeemer. And so Job, when he faces that situation of unimaginable suffering, still manages to say, "I know that my Goel, my Redeemer, lives and will walk this earth." He clings to the hope that God will come and save his situation and vindicate him. In Isaiah, God speaks more than once about being the Goel, the Redeemer of Israel, as they are suffering exile in Babylon. And when we move on to the New Testament, when we talk as Christians of being redeemed through what Jesus has done for us, it's that same picture that we are using. That God has redeemed us, that when our birthright was gone, when we were slaves to sin and to death, Jesus came as our Goel, our Redeemer, to bring us back into God's family. Let's go back to that other word, chesed, that, as we said, speaks so richly about God's love for us. It comes, I think there's about 250 times in the Old Testament, and the vast majority of those speak about God's chesed, God's love for us. Indeed, when on Mount Sinai God speaks to Moses about God's nature, his self-revelation, this is what God says to Moses. I am the Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands, and forgiving wickedness, rebellion and sin. Chesed. But the Old Testament also uses the word hesed for human-to-human relationships. It makes it clear there's a strong connection between God's hesed, God's love for us, and our hesed, our love for other people. As we have experienced God's hesed, so we are to go and show chesed to others as well. It underpins this famous verse from the book of Micah. He has shown you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? To act justly, and to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. I have shown you chesed, God says, and what is now required of you? To go and do chesed yourselves. This idea of a reciprocal arrangement between the chesed that God shows and the chesed that we show to others is there in the book of Ruth. It first popped up in chapter 1 last week, but it's the other way round. So in chapter 1 we heard these words. As Naomi urges Ruth and Orpah to go back to their family homes, she says, "Go back each of you to your mother's home. May the Lord show you kindness, chesed, as you have shown kindness, chesed, to your dead husbands and to me." In other words, she says, as you have shown chesed to me and my family, may God in turn show chesed to you. And here again in chapter 2, when Naomi hears of the kindness that Boaz has shown, she asks that God may bless Boaz, the God who, she says, has not stopped showing kindness, chesed, to the living and the dead. And indeed, God never stops showing his chesed. And we should never stop showing chesed to those around us. We should follow in Boaz's footsteps. When Boaz does for Ruth so much more than the gleaning laws required of him. As Jesus says to us, freely you have received, freely give.
Today we move on to our second week of looking at the book of Ruth. Last week Steve introduced us to the story of Naomi and her two daughters-in-law, Ruth and Orpah, all three of the women sadly widowed. Naomi plans to return to Bethlehem in Judah. Orpah initially follows but turns back. Ruth, however, continues with Naomi. For more than 20 years, I was a frequent visitor to Israel, working as a consultant to two companies on the outskirts of Jerusalem. It was always a busy place to be working in, but every so often something would jump out at me, remind me I was in the land of the Bible, the land where Jesus was born, grew up, and conducted his ministry. And I remember one particular day I was asked to go to the head office at a place called En Karim near Jerusalem to meet a new employee, someone who was going to work in finance. And his manager came up, and as we shook hands, he said, "This is Boaz." And I thought, Boaz? Suddenly I felt transported into the book of Ruth, because Boaz is the new significant character that enters our story at the beginning of chapter 2. We find Naomi and Ruth are alone. They're isolated after arriving in Judah. They've left a land in famine and arrive now at a time of harvest. Instead of depending on Naomi, Ruth decides to act. To help herself and Naomi, she goes out to follow the practice of gleaning. It's the right of the poor or the stranger to follow the harvesters, gathering up any overlooked grain as they move through the fields. She finds herself working in fields owned by Boaz, who's a relative of Naomi's late husband. Is it chance that she finds herself in Boaz's fields? Or has she been guided there? Boaz arrives at the fields and respectfully greets his workers, and is greeted in return. He asks his overseer, because he's obviously noticed Ruth, who is that young woman? In the overseer's eyes, the fact that he has noticed is that she is a Moabite, a stranger. She's not one of us. Boaz and Ruth meet for the first time in a public space where others are present. They hold their first conversation. Boaz is helpful, considerate, urging Ruth to stay within his fields for the duration of the harvest, assuring her that the men have been instructed to respect her and leave her alone. Ruth and Boaz show excellent qualities. Ruth is obviously hardworking, and we know she is loving and faithful to her mother-in-law, Naomi. Boaz goes far beyond the requirements of the law in the kindness he shows toward Ruth the Moabite. Question here for us: how do we welcome strangers, those who are different, i.e., not like us? We've been living for the last 3 months during the COVID-19 crisis, the international pandemic. We've been challenged to think especially of those working in the NHS, those working in care homes and related sectors, many of whom are not from the UK, from many different parts of the world. But they've all put themselves in harm's way for the benefit of all of us. And some have lost their lives in the process. Let's go back to Ruth. She returns from the fields back to Naomi and brings an abundance of grain. And also even part of her meal she couldn't finish because she was given so much. Naomi hears the story of the meeting with Boaz and is quick to give honor to God. The Lord bless him, she says. That first meeting between Ruth and Boaz reminded me of a famous fictional meeting between Elizabeth Bennet and Mr. Darcy at the ball at the Assembly Rooms in Netherfield, at the very beginning of Jane Austen's novel Pride and Prejudice. We're told when Mr. Darcy and his party came in, he soon drew the attention of the room by his fine, tall person and handsome features, and also the fact he's very proud and doesn't want to mix with any of them. His friend urges him to dance with Elizabeth Bennet, who's standing without a partner. Darcy says she's tolerable, but not handsome enough to tempt me. Unfortunately, Elizabeth overhears these derogatory comments and thinks of him as the proudest, most disagreeable man in the world. Although the two of them don't know it, it's the beginning of a love story. Boaz, a wealthy and influential farmer with a place in society, treats Ruth, a widow without any influence at all, far away from her original home. He treats her with care and he treats her with kindness. And that's the beginning of another love story. So a final thought about Ruth. Although she may not have recognized it, God's guidance has been with her every step of the way. She went out to work, to glean in the fields, and just happened to be in Boaz's fields, who just happened to be a relative of her mother-in-law. As we go about our daily lives, God is working in ways that we may not notice. We should have faith that God is directing our lives for his purpose. Amen.